Okay, so welcome to part two of my five-part class series, Making Democracy Safer and Higher, about my dissertation. Today we're going to be talking about the theoretical perspectives behind my work. So, similar to what we did last time, I just wanted to start with some general questions that anyone can answer if they want to. First is, have you ever heard of the US doing something, literally anything, to promote or aid or defend speech right?
My cousin Dexter works as a linguist overseas to promote democracy. I don't really know more about it, but my cousin Dexter, his primary specialization is Arabic.
Yeah.
And that happened. My family is Jewish.
Okay.
And before my dad complicated things after they were Orthodox. So
Sorry. Tremendous. Anything else? Yeah.
I know like your parents about like NGOs and I think it's fun to talk about like schools and hear us like but
I remember it was great. I felt a lot about the end of the time. I was 16 maybe and not thinking about these things yet. But I do remember a lot of the like, oh, we have to like kill what's this place from Libya? Gaddafi, yeah. Because we need democracy in Libya or whatever. But I remember a lot of that stuff. I was following it.
yeah, kill this guy to defend democracy.
Yeah.
With hindsight, I'm like, well, all right.
But no, that's good. So like governmental organizations and state government agencies. It's also sold where like they say you can do it from democracy through killing people, right? Like, killing that guy will bring democracy to that country. Weapons, military force, even honestly.
Like Israel is the Western democracy of the Arab world, so we need to kill all the Palestinians to bring Western democracy to them or whatever. It's like, yeah,
Crusade, here we go.
Yeah. And I remember when they were covering the taking back proposal Iraq from ISIS to the West, and that was pretty much completely destroyed the city. There were some like British reporters saying like everything is destroyed, so many are dead, yet they operate.
Basically said we didn't want it anyway, bombs.
Yeah. Anything else?
What are the values of democracy for me? It's where everyone respects each other's voice, each other's ability to, add to, like, instead of an opposite opinion detracting from democracy, an opposite opinion only adds to it because it more perspectives, more information. It ideally it would increase the amount of information that people are able to come to through consensus, or at least through extensive debate.
Yeah, that's pluralism, a you points of something.
Yeah, and not having to not having to change somebody else's mind. Like, it's respecting where people are coming from and not having to enforce that. Like, freedom ends where another person's begins.
Yeah.
And so respecting your space and their space is sort of the cornerstone of it, at least at its best.
Anything else values of democracy?
A bit what?
Yeah, or remind, just
So like personal rights to the economy, but also economic rights as well. We better values that I would think
Values of capitalism.
about democracy.
I think the values of capitalism are just how high can we stack this plate? How high can we stack these plates? And it's not a matter of, how many plates can the waiter carry? It's a matter of how high can we stack them? Can we get to the ceiling? Can we remove the ceiling and get higher? Stack more plates. We stack more plates.
Okay. Maximizing productivity or profits, not so much how youth are involved in that process.
Not recognizing what their ability is, just pushing it as far as it will go, and then there will be people inevitably who take it those steps further. That's what exploitation is.
Right.
And it just leaves room for that. It's not that that's in like what it's for, but that's inevitably what happens, and more often than if we were more cognizant of what these individual units are capable of doing, or like what would be a respectable thing to expect from them.
Any other values for capitalism or democracy? Marcos.
Yes.
Sorry. Yeah, that's you.
Oh, it's just prioritizing personal success over competition.
Yeah, individual gain value over public
Good prosperity.
Yeah. Yeah, first.
Yeah, I was just gonna say like I mean, I was thinking about the AIDS spot to there. Yeah, you take a look at that. You sit back, I think that happens to the off. Yeah, it's like this. It's not a definition.
Yeah, so that lets one for a bit. Is capitalism compatible with democracy? In what ways is it?
I think that before there was an order established, which pretty much happens immediately to some extent, but then people fight back and they come to a tacit agreement that is always contested. Like in that space where it is contested, it is within the values of democracy, I feel, because people are able to pursue different things. They're able to hold different values and enterprise to their heart's desire, to their heart's content. But the thing is that nobody's ever content with things as they are. There will always be people trying to stack the advantages in their favor. And so eventually power accumulates. And, that when it gets to that stage, it's incompatible with democracy completely because it co-opts democracy. Democracy becomes a commodity, just another commodity to exploit.
But you did that stage of capitalism, right?
I feel like, it's not this stuff. It's up to just like say that's like it's very complex. There's elements to set, but it's like there's not well, there's about the absolutely shut down. So, or I guess in that one of that work, but not different. It's the workers there are doing that. When they get traction, that the less appear about power, that it goes.
So freedom in the name.
All right. Yeah, so it can place limits on democracy, enforce property, enforce property. And go so far with it. Not so much.
And the profits always have to rise. That's the thing. They always have to rise, otherwise things collapse. And power accumulates only further in the hands of people who already have it. And then everybody else is left in the dust, left with the scraps, left to fight over the scraps, essentially. And that's like what we see from every depression ever, that power in the hands of the powerful only grows.
Yeah, so there's I know Marxists call that to support the
Yeah, at least in comparison to others, they do take a hit, but the overall economy takes a hit. And so in comparison to everybody else, to the common person, the worker, their power does grow.
Of course. Big final thoughts. Got a number of quotes that I'll try to not be super boring about, but hopefully they're interesting. Okay, so I'm going to talk about democracy promotion, like scholarship at first. So if you're talking about US democracy promotion, you want to read about it, and you get all the academic books that you can generally split the academic books into kind of two perspectives or two camps. And one of those are the promoters, people who think that democracy promotion is generally good or possible, or it at least attempts to do what it says it attempts to do, just promote democracy and rule of law and stuff like that, and human rights. These people tend to have a liberal internationalist. Some people call it a neo-Tocquevillian. You ever heard of that? Like this Tocqueville, who wrote about democracy in America in the early 1800s. They're of that perspective that the liberal world order is generally good. It's generally positive. It's a progressive thing that should be protected and promoted around the world. And then you have people who are much more critical of democracy promotion, who tend to come from a Gramscian Marxist perspective, and they'll talk about what that is. The important thing to understand is that the vast majority of the books that you'll get on democracy promotion come from people who have a promoter or a fairly positive opinion toward democracy promotion, generally written by academics or diplomats. And these books and articles, the reason why they're such a big majority is because there's a multi-billion-dollar democracy promotion industry that a lot of these people work for. So a guy named Thomas is one of the most prominent promoter or liberal internationalist writers of democracy promotion. And he has worked for the National Endowment for Democracy. He's worked for the National Democratic Institute. He's worked for USAID, all these democracy promotion think tanks and NGOs and even some government agencies. So these people tend to have a professional relationship with the thing that they're writing about, the industry, the organizations that they're writing about, which can still be very valuable, but that's their perspective. So when did the US start promoting democracy? What kind of democracy does it promote? So most scholars go back to Woodrow Wilson as the kind of first official person to try to promote democracy through means other than the US military, which is very interesting. So some people say we'll trace it back to Thomas Jefferson even. A lot of people will also trace it back to the Spanish-American War when the US took over the Philippines. And so there's kind of an implicit assumption that democracy promotion can be done and has historically been done through military force. But Woodrow Wilson is the first one to try to attempt it through nonviolent means. With things like his League of Nations, trying to create the League of Nations after World War I, his 14 points policy, promoting what they called constitutional order at the time. They didn't necessarily use the term democracy, but saying promoting constitutional orders, so things are codified into law. Then the people who are pretty big in keeping the story of how we got to promoting democracy are usually JFK and then especially Reagan are big ones. For what kind of democracy they promote, it's a pretty minimalist definition. I think I mentioned this real quick last week, but it basically means you get free and fair elections where nobody's really intimidated to vote for one party or the other, and you have multiple candidates, 2 or more parties involved in the process. And things like freedom of the press, the ability for people to express their politics, especially if they have the money to be able to express it more so by opening statements, things like that. That's all considered to be part of democracy that US promotes. Economic and social democracy, though, is excluded. The idea that when they would go to promote democracy, or they have these NGOs or agencies talk to government officials, so you have newly elected government in Latin American countries like that. And this newly elected government says, we want to nationalize our oil industry. The NGOs, the Americans would say that has nothing, nationalizing this industry to promote economic equity has nothing to do with democracy. That's not what democracy is about. They might not actively try to stop it. In some cases they will try to stop it, but they will not do anything to try to promote that outlook. On the other hand, if a government says we're a newly elected government and we want to privatize our oil industry, then they will say that's awesome. Having free market competition, open market, that is a absolute pillar of democracy, and they will help them to privatize things. They will promote that kind of stuff and not promote economic democracy, or what you might consider economic democracy. So the critical scholars will say that democracy promotion equates capitalism and free markets with democracy, and they'll say that the way that they try to promote democracy, the kind of democracy that they want people to implement into their system, essentially makes economic and social democracy possible. They want it to be so integrated into the world economy, so dependent on, frankly, oligarchical interests in the country that, like, structurally, even if a newly elected government wants to implement social democracy or economic democracy, it's basically impossible for them to do so. There was some really famous cases in late 80s, early 90s in Latin America of governments being elected on a social justice or economic justice platform, saying that they're going to resist neoliberal reforms, resist privatization, they're going to have more economic democracy. And because of how the system is set up, and also because of their lack of will or, corruption, yeah, they did these U-turns and implemented reforms that they said they would implement, privatizing things, cutting social welfare programs, stuff like that. What they call it is polyarchy, not democracy. In fact, this is something that, like, the people who were involved in creating democratization theory and, like, theorizing what democracy means and how we should promote it, they actually called it polyarchy as well. So it's a thing kind of in between democracy and dictatorship, where you have multiple interests involved in the creation of government, even if some voices are going to be more powerful than others. It's a more democratic system, but they don't like to call it democracy necessarily.
Is the difference between that and oligarchy that anyone can become a polyarch, and anyone can be, well, potentially, if they like rock the boat enough, they can be ousted, but
yeah, it's yes, theoretically, it's more social and economic mobility, and their ideas are that if you have free and fair elections and pretty much everyone can participate in them, even if it's very managed by elites and like elite politicians, elite business owners, elite party leaders, that you'll have sufficient enough popularity, and sufficient democracy to be able to call it democratic. Even if it's not a full democracy. Be like they would want to like direct democracy in like Asian Athens terms, where you don't even have elected representatives. Okay, so that'll all hopefully become more clear as I go into the actual historical case studies things. But here's a little bit of history of U.S. democracy and U.S. democracy. So if you look at how America's democracy is set up, who set it up and why, the Constitution, there are two great historical quotes. I won't give them because I'm already giving like names and folks for people to remember. But if you research this history, you'll find that both Federalists, as they call them, and Democratic Republicans were the more like quote-unquote democratic people. People like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were Democratic Republicans, whereas Alexander Hamilton was a Federalist. Both of these kind of early factions in U.S. politics did not want to have full democracy in the United States. They wanted to be restricted to mainly property owners, especially landowners. They did not think that lower class people could responsibly engage in politics, responsibly engage in the democratic system. And so they put restrictions on popular participation in the Constitution. And it's, with amendments and things, it's got a little more democratic over time, but that is the original vision, that there's a skepticism of lower class involvement and lower class domination of democratic politics.
yeah, because there are more voices down there and they don't know better. We know better.
Yeah. Yeah. They love, in like the Federalist Papers, they love to talk about protecting minority interests and minority rights. And when they say that, they mean like upper class rich people. who are in the minority in terms of numbers.
You're impressed.
Yeah. So, despite being the first democratic republic in the Americas that fought against colonialism supposedly and was like promoting these Enlightenment ideals of like universal rights, the second republic that we get in the New World in the modern era is Haiti, when the slaves revolt against being enslaved and successfully defeat the French and establish a republic. And the U.S. completely rejects them. They do not want anything to do with Haiti. Yes. Sorry, I guess. I'll share the recording. Thanks. But so they completely reject the first Black Republic, the second Republic in the New World. You can imagine why. White supremacy and how many slaves they had. They were concerned about their own slaves revolting. Under Thomas Jefferson in 1804, they refused to even recognize Haitian independence from France, and they don't recognize Haitian independence until the Civil War. It's nearly 60 years until Lincoln. They don't even recognize Haiti as an independent country. Completely reject that. Because essentially what they wanted to do was they wanted to be more like the Europeans. Even though they had kind of rejected Europe and kind of rejected the UK, they wanted to be part of the imperialist and that approach to democracy and approach to colonize people, it has a important consistency throughout the story. So, according to people who advocate U.S. democracy promotion, some of the early examples of democracy promotion are Thomas Jefferson's democratic peace theory, which essentially just argued that democracies tend to not go to war with each other, and people still argue this to this day. That democracies like the UK and the US don't go to war with each other, even though we did twice. And importantly, when they say that, they don't apply that to something like the U.S. overthrowing the democratic government of Guatemala in the War. They don't consider that to be against this democratic peace idea. Either because they don't consider something like Guatemala at that time to be really a democracy, or they don't consider what the U.S. did to it to be an act of war. Which I think is important to keep in mind, who actually gets to be considered a democracy, or who gets to be considered having war brought upon them, and versus we just consider it a police action or some covert operations that not really war. It's just some minor meddling among friends. No big deal. So they go back to that, or they'll go back to William McKinley Sicily as atheist growth educates his lives and Christianize the Philippines. That's President McKinley down there in the bottom right. In the top left here is a little political cartoon promoting U.S. intervention in what would become the Spanish-American War. Cuba was fighting for its independence from Spain at the time in 1897, and in this cartoon, Cuba is personified as this small brown child, which I think tells you a lot about how they view colonized people as basically as children or as demons, depending on whether they want to build sympathy for them or promote violence against them. And then you have Lady Liberty representing the American people, reaching out, wanting to help the Cubans, and Uncle Sam there representing the U.S. government is kind of blinding himself to what's going on in Cuba, and he's sitting on a gunboat, which is very important as well. It's showing that like he's flying to his own power. Like he could be using his great power and these great battleships to help bring democracy to Cuba. And there's this idea that democracy can be brought and barrel become use places. I think something that's again revealing about their perspective on democracy and their perspective on non-white, non-European, non-Western people is when these people talk about democracy promotion, they only talk about the territories that the U.S. didn't try to like bring into its own country as a state. So like the U.S. conquering all these indigenous groups in like this state, or like the mainland U.S., what became the 50 states, is not considered like part of the democracy promotion story, even though they say that a lot of the roots of democracy promotion are promoting civilization and promoting constitutional order. And if you learn anything about like the Trail of Tears, you'll learn that the groups that were deported west of the Mississippi were known as the 5 civilized tribes. They were called civilized because they had adopted Western forms of making money and forms of government, their own presses. They even had their own constitutions. You got like constitutional order, promoting constitutional order among the indigenous groups, and trying to civilize them. You would think that would be part of this story of democracy promotion, but it's not, according to people who generally have a positive view of democracy promotion. Okay. So I'm going to get into Marxism for a couple minutes here, and I'm just going to give a general like definition of Marxism that for me, Marxism is an attempt to kind of take the ideas of socialism that had already been developed by like what they call utopian socialists and people before that who had these ideas of a more social society. Taking those ideas and trying to turn the liberation of humanity, the realization of those ideas into a science, to try to figure out how can we open up the hood of this society that we live in, figure out how it works, so that we can figure out where the contradictions are, where the big hurdles are of like, we want to get from point A to point B, where we are now, to this like ideal socialist or communist society that we want. What are the obstacles that are in our way? How do those obstacles work? How can we most effectively get from where we are now to where we want to be? So for me, there's a revolutionary spirit to it. There's also a like scientific organized spirit to it of like we need to figure out the most effective ways of approaching these problems. And for me, it's inherently socialist as well. It has like socialism on its communist horizon as part of its spirit. So that's a basic definition of Marxism I'll give just to work with for now. But I wanted to talk about what Marxism can say about imperialism. So I'm going to start here with a quote from one of the most important imperialists of the 1800s, 19th century, Cecil Rhodes. If you've ever heard of like a Rhodes Scholarship, I think that's named after him. There's a ton of things in like Britain named after him, and like South Africa. He was responsible for colonizing a lot of South Africa, like Rhodesia. Like that. It's literally called Rhodesia after Cecil Rhodes. It's now called Zimbabwe. But there's a big mausoleum there in South Africa, like honoring Cecil Rhodes, which a lot of people in South Africa are still pissed about. And this is him stretching a telegram wire from the north end of Africa to the southern end, and colonizing it, which was something that the British did. They had a whole telegram wire going from Egypt to South Africa. So this is what he says in 1895. He says, I was in the East End of London, working West Quarter, yesterday, and attended a meeting of the unemployed. I listened to the wild speeches, which were just a cry for bread, bread. On my way home, I pondered over the scene and became more than ever convinced of the importance of imperialism. My cherished idea is a solution to a social problem, i.e., in order to save the 40 million inhabitants of the United Kingdom from bloody civil war, we colonial statesmen must acquire new lands, settle the surplus population, provide new markets for goods produced in the factories and mines. The empire, as I've always said, is a bread and butter question. If you want to avoid civil war, you must become imperialists. So what he's saying there is that there's a class struggle in the UK. There's these unemployed people who are upset, and becoming imperialist is a way of muting some of that class conflict, of tamping it down, keeping it manageable, keeping the poor people in our country happier. So here, I'm going to give a couple more quotes. Apologies for all the long ones. The Lenin one, okay, this is probably most important because, again, around this time, late 1800s, early 1900s, people were seeing a change in capitalism in that competition was being replaced with monopoly. As these corporations competed with each other, one corporation or a few corporations got the upper hand, and they became monopolies. They became like really massive corporations. We don't have a bunch of little small businesses anymore. We have a bunch of like really big, massive corporations that make up the bulk of the economy. And there might also be some small businesses, but they don't matter here. Also, on top of that, Lenin and other people are seeing that capitalism, it's monopolizing. It's also becoming dominated by banks, which makes sense because they're the money people, right? Capitalism is all about making money and holding like the almighty dollar above everything else. So it makes sense that banks would be the thing that kind of take over and become the most important part of the economy. On top of that, they're also exporting a lot of capital. So these big corporations have kind of carved up their own local markets in their own countries. So to keep expanding, they have to go abroad. They have to find new markets, find new ways of making profit outside of their home market, because everything's already been divided up. But once you get to a point, certainly by this time, the world is already pretty much divided up. Everyone has their colonies, and there's not many land that haven't already been colonized, opened up to capitalist profit and investment and exploitation. So that's when things get a little dicey, and sometimes you have wars or you have competition over colonies and profits there. So here, I'm going to read this Lenin quote that kind of hammers home what Cecil Rhodes was talking about there. So Lenin says, capitalism has now singled out a handful, less than 1/10 of the inhabitants of the globe, less than 1/5 of the most generous, and liberal population, of exceptionally rich and powerful states which plunder the whole world. Obviously, out of such enormous super profits, since they are obtained over and above the profits which capitalists squeeze out the workers of their own country, it is possible to bribe the labor leaders and upper stratum of the labor aristocracy. That's just what the capitalists of the advanced countries are doing. They're bribing them in 1,000 different ways, direct, indirect, overt, and covert. And on top of that, I think there's this quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, the fathers of sociology in the U.S., really important Black leader in late 1800s up to mid 1900s. And I'm not going to say he uses some he uses racial slurs to kind of hammer the point home, but I won't say those. So he says the white working man has been asked to share the spoil of exploiting, say, Asians and Africans. It is no longer simply the merchant prince or the aristocratic monopoly or even the employing class that is exploiting the world. It is the nation, a new democratic nation composed of united capital and labor. So the idea here is that in a Leninist conception of things, imperialism becomes the primary contradiction of the world. You can't overcome capitalism because capitalism is able to invigorate itself and tamp down on class struggle, tamp down on class conflicts, because it's exporting the worst excesses of class conflict, the worst excesses of capitalist exploitation onto poorer people of the world, and creating this, what W.E.B. Du Bois is pointing to, a kind of global color line of, white at the top, everyone else below them. So capitalism becomes, because of imperialism, it's not as bad as in America or in Britain as it is in Mali or Burkina Faso, because the worst excesses are exported to those countries. And out of all those profits that you're reaping from like really exploiting the shit out of poorer people of color, you can have unions in your own country. You can have unemployment insurance. You can have like decent standards of living for most people. You can have democracy. You can have freedom of speech because people aren't as they have more stake in the system. They aren't as exploited. They have some skin in the game. They're not going to just be like ready to tear down your door at any minute. Because you're exporting all that misery to other places. So Leninist conceptions, argue that you have to overcome imperialism before you can really overcome capitalism, because imperialism makes it impossible to overthrow your bourgeois government in the rich countries. Moving into like the post-Cold War or the post-World War II era of what they call the American century, which is basically 1945 until where we are now, when America's then number one economy, they've been on top. Really important theorist and work comes from Kwame Nkrumah, first president of an independent Ghana, a big anti-colonial revolutionary leader. He writes this book called Neocolonialism in 1965, and he argues that, what colonialism is going away, these countries are becoming independent, but you still have these neo-colonial relationships that basically maintain the same pattern of exploitation that you had before. So it's more obscure and indirect, this idea of neo-colonialism. But you're still super exploiting poor countries, you're still keeping them underdeveloped, and you're still bringing in excess profits to try to champ down class tensions in the rich countries. Important development here is that the US, people probably know, US becomes like the most powerful country in the world after World War II, and they really take the reins of global imperialism. Whereas before you had like Britain above all, being the country that was exporting capitalism and enforcing it through military might and all manner of things. You have the US taking on that role of being the global policeman of capitalism. So in this view, the Cold War is not the kind of like ideological battle that you're told about in high school between the US and the Soviet Union. It's more a pretext. Cold War is more of a pretext for the US to seek global primacy as imperialist power, to maintain neo-colonial relationships with the global South, and to neutralize any alternatives to capitalism, especially socialist Marxists. Now, as this is going on, I just wanted to point this out. speaking to like imperialism and monopolization. Once you get to the 21st century, like information industries are extremely important. So like the industries that create news, the industries that create entertainment media, the industries that create your computers and your smartphones, satellites, things like that, is an incredibly important part of capitalist, like global capitalism. This guy, Christian Fuchs, calls it the, which is unfortunately, but I think he's German. Oh, really? Yeah. He argues that information industries became basically like top 3 or 4 based on how concentrated they are, how big they are, how much capital they export around the world, how integrated they are in with financial industries, big banks. So as far as like imperialism goes, in a Leninist conception of imperialism, information industries, media, all that stuff is an important part. It's not the most important. Finance is still the most important, and then right below that, you've got like the car industry and like oil and the energy sector. But it's pretty close up there. Now, what does Marxism have to say about culture and ideology? So I'm gonna just try to give a basic like conception of it because it's complicated. So generally with Marxists, you have a split between what they call the base, which is like the economy, how stuff is produced, how people make money. And then you have the superstructure, which is like the ideas of a society, but also like laws, art, religion, philosophy, education, what you might call civil society. I couldn't make that thing bigger, but it's generally that the base is generally dominant, generally more important thing to consider. The base shapes the superstructure, and the superstructure can also kind of shape the base as well, though. But it mostly helps to maintain it in terms of like legitimating the base. So it moves in a dialectical relationship, as in like these two things, one might be more dominant than the other in general, but they're constantly moving, they're constantly changing, and they're constantly in relationship with each other, constantly evolving. So you can't just say like base is always going to be dominant at every given situation, or that superstructure is always going to do this to maintain the base or to legitimate it at any given moment. You have to look at the evolution of things, how things are moving. Really important guy for understanding like Marxism and culture is a guy named Antonio Gramsci. He was an Italian Marxist who was imprisoned under Mussolini, and Mussolini being a fascist, really clamped down on the communists in Italy, and he died inside of a fascist prison. As he was in prison, he wrote a lot of his ideas about basically like why didn't the revolution come when we had World War I and we had the Great Depression, all this like really awful stuff was happening. He was very upset about capitalism. Why didn't the workers rise up and unite together to fight capitalism? And he comes up with this idea of cultural hegemony, which I'll generally summarize as the process of capitalists, because of their economic power, they're able to gain an upper hand in civil society and law, so like media, education, all these institutions of like creating knowledge and meaning in the world. And they're able to make their own views of the world, which are generally self-motivated, things that legitimate their profits and their property. They're able to make that into the kind of common sense that everyone's taught as they grow up. So as they go to schools, they deal with things that are codified as law, as they're brought up with like proper manners. Becomes what he calls the common sense of society generally. The important thing there is that this idea of cultural hegemony is kind of unique to the advanced, rich, capitalist, industrialized countries. It doesn't apply so much to the poorer colonized countries where there's a lot less democracy and a lot more coercion. He says that this system basically rules by consent, armored with threat of coercion. So people have buy-in, people have some democracy, people have some freedom, people have some rights to free speech, but there's a limit to it. There's coercion to deal with what they would call like deviants, people who refuse to consent. And then there are also moments of crisis where this apparatus of coercion is going to be applied to the entire society, but it needs to be. Again, you can think about his experiences with fascism. Italy had this like constitutional monarchy. It was becoming a more democratic, modern, liberal system. And then shortly after World War I, Mussolini takes over, and a lot of the liberals actually support it. A lot of the kind of respectable capitalists actually support Mussolini, because as like having saved Italy from the threat of communism and socialism. And so he's basically saying, when the chips are down, the capitalists, whether they're liberal or reactionary or whatever, when the chips are down and things are really under threat, they're gonna really clamp down with an iron fist. Keep that in mind. Okay. I went through this a little bit last week, but I'll just give a quick summary. Going into media imperialism and the relations between media and imperialism. So people like Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky explain before, Manufacturing Consent, his released Warsh book, for existing scholarship. They take a political economy approach. They ask things like, who owns the media? Who funds it? How do mainstream media figures relate to other elite figures? Like, do they go to the same parties? Do they go to the same schools as like the Jeff Bezoses of the world, or the Joe Bidens of the world? Do they go to the same country clubs? Do they go to the same think tanks? How does mainstream media reinforce capitalist hegemony, cultural hegemony in general, and how does it facilitate? They're especially interested in like military intervention, like violence. How does the violence of imperialism and foreign intervention? So how does media facilitate literally like bombing people? Like how does media make it easier for you to inflict violence on people abroad? And also how does media like kind of obscure that violence, or like allow you to sell a narrative of like promoting democracy or promoting civilization? So Herman and Chomsky come up with this propaganda model, and it generally looks at like how media is structured, so that it just has these biases kind of baked into the structure without anyone really needing to like have a conspiracy about things. And they argue that mainstream media is owned by for-profit corporations. They are for-profit corporations themselves, generally. They rely on corporate advertising for the revenue. They also rely on raw news information from official, legitimate, or credible sources. They get flack from people from those first three things for writing the wrong stuff. So if you're upsetting your advertisers or you're upsetting your corporate owners, you're going to get some flack for that. You might not get your piece published. You might get some criticism from your editor. Your editor might have to deal with people being angry at them. you might piss off the people that you need to get information from. So, like, if you write a bad thing about like your local police department, the local police department might not talk to you and provide you with important information that other people get to report on. And they and their final filter, they point to this general thing of like, they call it a national religion of anti-communism at the time. We can generally apply it to like cultural hegemony as well. There's just these like this common sense stuff that you're expected to come into the profession with and like accept as normal. It's usually like a ideology that capitalism is good and democratic and socialism is bad and dangerous, violent, and anti-democratic generally. For my project, the third filter is the really important one there. So, where do these people get their news from? Is very important. And the idea of creating official sources, creating sources of news that then provide the raw information that these media outlets depend on to make their stories. I'm just going to point to this little model here, this little triangle thing that they call a deflected source model, or deflected source propaganda. It essentially means you have a propaganda story that you want to promote to the world, you want to get it out there. Rather than just like sending it out yourself, you give it to a third party. Like you create another media outlet, or you create an NGO or something like that, and that provides the information, which then goes out to the audience that you want to go out to. So, like rather than someone like Dick Cheney or like Joe Biden putting out a piece of propaganda or a piece of like narrative that they want to push, they send it to a think tank that they're friendly with, for example, and then that think tank publishes this thing and promotes it as its own idea. And so the people getting this message don't know that it's originally from Joe Biden or it's originally from Dick Cheney. They think it's from this think tank, or they think it's from the New York Times. So that's an important like model of just like what these democracy promotion institutions are consistently doing. They're constantly making these like deflective source propaganda outlets. Okay, I think this might be my last big quote, but I think it's a cool one. So, we're going to talk about how do you combine like hegemony, imperialism, and what I introduced last week, which is team politics. These kind of methods of politics that involve either inadvertently or inadvertently dissolving popular like knowledge and public accountability for what they've done. So I just wanted to give this quote from the farewell address of Juan Jose Arevalo. He was the first democratically elected president of Guatemala in the 1940s. And he was a generally like liberal guy, not super radical, but Guatemala was a really rough place to be the reformer in, and still is a very rough place to do politics in. And he had faced a lot of coup attempts throughout his presidency, which the U.S. either like tacitly or like pretty actively supported throughout his time there. And his successor, Jacobo Arbenz, would be the famous guy who was overthrown in 1954, and Guatemala's democracy would come to an end as a result of the CIA covert operations. So he's someone who can kind of speak to these issues. And this is him saying goodbye to the nation and giving the reins to his like successor of basically saying like, here you go. This is his like parting words to the people of Guatemala. It says, on the 15th of March 1945, when I ascended the presidency of the nation, I was possessed by a romantic fire. I still believed, besides and with reason, that the Republic of Guatemala could rule itself without submission to external forces, free from mandates that did not emanate from the popular will of the majority. It was then with the deepest despondency and pain that I felt, with consequent indignation, the pressure of that anonymous force that rules without laws or morals international relations and the relationships of men. This is good. The war that began in 1939 ended, but in the ideological dialogue between the two worlds and the two leaders, President Franklin Roosevelt lost the war. The real victor was Hitler. Little caricatures of Hitler sprung up and multiplied in Europe and here in the Americas. It is my personal opinion that the contemporary world is moved by the ideas which served as the foundation on which Hitler rose to power. So that's a pretty dismal view of the post-World War II order of the world by the guy who was the first democratic elected president of Guatemala and not a revolutionary. So what he's kind of pointing to is this idea of lawlessness, international lawlessness, and dark forces that or shadowy forces that are crushing attempts to create a more democratic and just society where we're in. And the reference to Hitler is really important because a lot of this stuff kind of derives from Nazism. So in the 1920s, you have this jurist in Germany who later becomes a Nazi official and helps create the laws of Nazi Germany and justifies Hitler's rise. He comes up with this idea that when you have an emergency, when you have a state of exception where the state, society itself is under threat, you're going to have an exception to the rule of law. If you're in an emergency, you can't be worrying about procedures and votes and all that stuff. You have to act quickly and decisively. And he argues that the sovereign is he who decides the exception to the law. So whoever decides when there's a state of exception, when you can act without the law, you can act even against the law, that's the person who is, or the people who are really sovereign over a country. Applying that to the United States, there's this really great book you can look up. Just came out less than a couple of years ago. If you want something that discusses the idea of deep politics or a deep state that isn't Alex Jones nonsense or Donald Trump nonsense, this is a great book for that. It's called American Exception: Empire and the Deep State by a political scientist. And he comes up with this idea called exceptions, which basically argues that U.S. imperialism, whatever you want to call it, foreign policy establishment, the deep state, I might just call it the upper echelon, the upper stratum of the U.S. state, of the bourgeois state, it just continuously ignores any of the U.S. laws. So, for example, there's this thing called the Supremacy Clause in the U.S. Constitution, which says that treaties that are ratified by the Senate become the supreme law of the land. And the Senate has ratified things like the UN Charter. The UN Charter declares it illegal to engage in violence or use the threat of violence in international law. So couing governments, doing these kind of violent covert operations, trying to overthrow governments, invading other countries, that's all illegal under the UN Charter. And because the UN Charter has been ratified by the Senate, it is also against the US Constitution. So it's non-constitutional. We do it all the time. And he calls this idea exceptionism. This kind of we're in a constant state of exception. There's always some excuse that gets given to ignore laws. Adding on to that, maybe this is self-explaining instead. It's another guy who basically studies the same thing, comes up with this idea of state primacy and democracy, about concerted actions or inactions by public officials that are intended to weaken or subvert popular control of their government. So you can think of, again, the coup in Guatemala that the U.S. orchestrated. that is a U.S. state crime against Guatemalan democracy. That people who get hurt on purpose plotted to overthrow the government of Guatemala and its citizens. So that's it. Okay, yeah, we're a little over time, but that's all I had for this. Just wanted to say we won't meet next week because it's spring break, and we won't meet the week after that because it's this room is already booked for another event. We can still have the BG Socialist meeting though. So we won't come back till the 18th, and then we'll actually get into some of the history of things. This is probably the roughest class because of all the trying to explain all the theory stuff is complicated and difficult and kind of dry, boring. But yeah, anyone have any questions or comments? Can I ask y'all what do you think of Marxism or what it is? We haven't really gotten to talk too much about like theory stuff in different kinds of socialism in long-range socialists.
Once I achieved just kind of like really talked about how you guys have a step down where stuff that's you're trying to you gotta actually education.
Yeah.
Expect that.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense. So it's the size of the outlook also. So that's the one that's so she will have some start to those. I would like to know like more about that.
Yeah. An easy thing you can do is look up Friedrich Engels' Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, where it gets to the history there from a Marxist perspective. He was Engels was Marx's like primary collaborator throughout Marx's life. I think they co-wrote like the Communist Manifesto, a lot of things. And he gives you, even if you don't want the kind of biased Marxist opinion of utopian socialists, he gives you the names and some of the works of like the original utopian socialists, so you can find that and look up what they wrote.
There's still like yeah, I don't know. How about that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I feel like that's always interesting to try to look for parallels to like today, because like a lot of these conversations we have today, they were having the same conversations 150 plus years ago. So it's interesting to try to draw parallels between the two. I mean, I think I would argue that my biases, I would argue that a lot of anarchists are utopian socialists, whereas as in they have a lot of the great ideas, they have a lot of great visions for the future, but they're not as good with actually making these things a reality in the real world on a large scale. You can be a little obsessed with like going from just like almost like flipping a switch, going immediately from point A to point B, of like expecting this like utopian society to kind of just like emerge from upheaval that like overthrows capitalism in one fell swoop. Who's yeah.
This, second,
Thank you. Yeah, I do want to try to not have everything come from a bunch of old white guys, Western white guys. I can always do better at that, but I do try to find like different diverse voices or different perspectives as much as I can, especially international ones. Like that's why I wanted to highlight Array Below there and one man from yeah, he looks more direct experience of these things.
somebody else, but she's not, yeah, for sure. But I did, but I don't know, I hadn't thought of it like that, but
Yeah, no, thank you. It's that one, especially when you have to like get into grad school and stuff, and everything becomes overly complicated. That one can be complicated to try to understand. Um, I think there's a great. I think something that helped me was actually old work by Mao, Mao Zedong, his work called On Contradiction. It's literally just called like On Contradiction. He goes really, Mao's pretty good at explaining things in easier to understand terms. Goes really well into like explaining like dialectics in a way that doesn't use a lot of like big complicated words like dialectics.
what is that?
Yeah. Okay. That's a good question. So it's a pillar of Marxism. Marxism, if you want to just like give it philosophical description, it is dialectical materialism. So the idea of materialism is here. Actually, I have another presentation, a slide that might be helpful for that. Do my ass. So this is a non-dialectical explanation of materialism, which is that you have the base, you have material conditions, like the physical environment, society's means of producing things, like how do people get the stuff that they need to survive? They do it by working in a field, do they do it by hunting and gathering, do they do it by working in a factory? Some people do it by owning a factory, stuff like that. and also your relation to those, like, so yeah, your relation to those means of production and those material conditions. Um, Material conditions create incentives, motives, and perspectives, and give rise to ideas. So your material conditions determine what your ideas are going to be. So if you're a slave owner, you're going to think like a slave owner. If you're a worker, you're going to think like a worker because of the material conditions you live in and your relations to production, what you need to do to survive. You're going to think in ways that help you survive that way. I like to give this idea of some of these examples here. Like there's old anthropological studies into like the different cosmologies of like ancient Egyptian versus Mesopotamian cultures. An interesting thing you'll find there is that like for the Mesopotamians, their gods, their like cosmology, their supernatural world is very like, it's kind of cruel, doesn't really care very much about humanity, doesn't really like care very much about the suffering of people. They're very vengeful, they're very easily offended, the gods. You really gotta watch out with them. Whereas like Egyptians, their idea of like the gods is much more benevolent, it's much more like they care about humanity, they want humanity to live well and prosper. They're not as easily offended. They're not as vengeful. And to explain those differences, why those differences exist, you can point to a materialist explanation. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the correct one, but a materialist explanation you can give is say, look at the river systems that they have to survive. The river systems are different. The Mesopotamian river systems, the Tigris and Euphrates, they flood kind of randomly. Sometimes they flood a lot. Sometimes they don't flood nearly as much. So sometimes you have droughts, you can't grow as much food. Sometimes you have massive floods that like sweep away whole villages, destroy things that way. It's unpredictable. Literally, like the nature that you live around is unpredictable. Whereas the Nile River floods the same amount at the same time every single year. It's just you can predict it. It's totally like it's orderly. So the explanation you can give is like, well, the Egyptian river system is much more orderly. It seems much more benevolent. So it would make sense that the people living there would have this idea that the universe is more benevolent. The universe is more orderly. Versus the Mesopotamians who live in a much more chaotic environment. Another great one I like to point at is this one, this idea of what made America exceptional. So there's always been this idea for a long time that America is an exceptional nation. It's different from all other countries. And in the late 1800s, there was this famous historian, Frederick Jackson Turner, and I just put his name on the like free real estate feed because that was basically his explanation. What made America exceptional? It was free real estate. It was not because the founding fathers had all these great, wonderful ideas. It was because we had this massive continent that we had the power and the willingness to just like genocide tons of people to take. Like we could just take all this land. We had all this like massive expanses that we could use to make our country prosper. And so essentially because of all that land that you're willing to take from other people, you can, again, similar to imperialism, you can export some of your worst excesses. Like if you're pissed off at your boss, you hate the town you're living in, you don't have good opportunities in life, you're downwardly mobile, you can just go out west and just take some land and create a base of living for yourself. Obviously you can only do that if you're a white straight man. But you had these opportunities that Europeans didn't have. Because the Europeans, everything's already settled. You want to go conquer some land, you got to really fight for that land. Whereas for the Americans, it was much easier to take land. And that allowed us to have more freedom, that allowed us to have more social mobility, more social equality, less class conflict. So yeah, those are the non-dialectical explanations for things. To make them dialectical, literally think about a dialogue, two people arguing with each other or talking with each other. It's like you have things in tension with each other. Sometimes they're cooperating, sometimes they're clashing, they're in conflict, depending on the situation and the manner of their relationship. But you have things that are in tension with each other or conversation with each other, and they're influencing each other. Things are constantly moving, things are constantly changing. Nothing is static or eternal. An example I like to give is with the development of Catholicism. So you have early Christianity. It's usually written up as a kind of triangle thing. So you have early Christianity on this side, which was more inspired by Judaism. Jesus was Jewish, and a lot of these early converts to Christianity were Jewish, and they had a lot of questions is this a new religion that we're creating? Is this something that's not Judaism? How much should we emphasize the teachings of Jesus versus how much should we emphasize the Old Testament? Should we require our our men to get circumcised? Circumcision was a requirement in Judaism, but it does not become a requirement for any sects of Christianity. So you have early, very Judaic influenced Christianity, and that kind of Christianity really gets going in the Roman Empire. So they're coming into contact with, say, Roman paganism, all these pagan beliefs and practices that, or what we call pagan now, in Europe and the Roman Empire. So they're interacting with each other, and sometimes they're really in conflict with each other. Sometimes it's less hostile. And I mean, you all probably know that paganism or Christianity becomes the dominant religion in Europe by hook or by crook, by through persuasion or through force. It becomes Christianity becomes the dominant thing. But those interactions with these older religions had influence on them. So these early beliefs don't just go away. They become part of this new thing that eventually becomes Roman Catholicism. So saints and Easter bunnies and Christmas trees, and all these things come from pagan beliefs and old pagan practices that influence the development of the medieval Catholic Church. For lots of reasons. I don't go into all the reasons why, but and it continues to evolve as it interacts with, say, colonial people that the Catholic Church starts to come into contact with, often colonizing, destroying, fighting with them, but being influenced by it nonetheless. When all the Puritans came to America, they really hated a lot of these pagan influences. They wanted to purify the church of those things. So in Massachusetts, it was illegal to celebrate Christmas. They do Christmas as a pagan holiday. So like wasn't until like the 1800s, I think, they got rid of the laws in Massachusetts. You'd be fined like public humiliated for like celebrating Christmas. It's the original war on Christmas. Yeah, like so it's this idea that like you can't just think of things as like static, one-way streets. Everything like things are in dialogue with each other, they're in tension, sometimes they're in conflict, but they're interacting. Uh, and um, and like time is constantly moving and like changing things, nothing can just stay still ever. Which I think, you know, if you want to talk about like intersectionality ever, I feel like that merges pretty well with it. Thanks, guys. Have a good night.
Have a good one. Sorry, thanks for meeting.
Yeah, no problem. I thank you for sitting around. Appreciate it. Don't go long. Thanks. I think intersectionality like matches up with like the idea of dialectics pretty well, because with intersectionality they tell you, you know, you can't just look at like someone's class, or you can't just look at someone's race in isolation. You have to look at it in relation to these other things that are going on. So like a black woman is going to experience race differently than a black man is going to experience in the United States. That is, is going to experience femininity or gender and gender relations differently than a white woman is going to. Class is also that's also a factor in that. So you can't look at things in isolation. You have to look at things in dialogue, in tension with its context, its environment, with everything else that's going on. Its fiction. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right. Adios. Yeah, I'll. Thank you all so much. Y'all can go back to, like, you know, go to the bathroom and get some water.